Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Melee's Turnwheel, the series that takes a retroactive look at the Fire Emblem series from FE4 up to the present day. So before we get any further into this, I'm going to address something that I'm sure at least a few of you are wondering. Why are we starting with 4? There's 3 whole numbers that come before 4 that we could be talking about. Well, the short answer is that Fire Emblem 1, 2, and 3 have all been remade in some fashion or another, and I don't think it's a particularly controversial opinion to say that 1 and 2 at the very least are much worse than their remakes. I know there's some people who feel that 3 is better than 12, and that's valid. I think that that's a perfectly reasonable opinion. I disagree. I think that 12 is one of the best games in the series, and I don't care for 3 all that much. So on top of that, just all the things I'm going to be talking about, there's going to be a lot of overlap if I talk about both games. There will be big gaps in between the games. Like if I were to do 1, obviously I won't be talking about its remake until 10 games later. But, it just didn't feel right to me to just rehash essentially the same content, because we're going to be talking about all sorts of stuff here. We're going to be talking about, yes, the maps and the gameplay, which are going to be different, but also story, characters, all that stuff, which is just the same in both games and much more fleshed out in the remake. So that's why we're skipping 1, 2, and 3 and going straight into 4. Alright, so let's talk a little bit about how this is going to be structured. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is news. Any news that's been going on in the Fire Emblem space. Most of the time there's not really going to be any, because this isn't a series that has, constant feed. There's not always a lot to be paying attention to. I guess that's true of any series, but Fire Emblem in particular seems to be it's hit the mainstream at this point, but it's definitely not as popular as something like Zelda. So this is not going to be something to talk about constantly. But this week there is actually a little bit of news, so that'll be fun to talk about. I'll get into that later. Whenever there's nothing, I might just skip this, or I might talk about stuff that I've been doing, just with other games I've been playing, other things going on for me, stuff like that. But for the most part, I'm probably just going to skip it unless I have something really interesting I want to talk about. After that, we talk about the chapter or chapters of the week, and this is where it's going to be a little bit different depending on the game. For Fire Emblem 4, which is what we're starting with, I'm only going to be doing 1 chapter a week. They're so huge. There's no way I could fit more than 1 into any given week. I mean, I could, but there'd be too much to talk about. These episodes are already going to be pretty long regardless, so I don't think there's really any need to drag them out anymore. But once we get into the games with shorter chapters, I'll be able to talk about multiple. Hopefully, I'm aiming for about 3 to 5 once we get into those games, but it's going to be a while before we get there. So, I have no way of knowing what that's going to be like, if that's going to be feasible, but that's my goal. And we're going to be talking about every aspect of the map. We're going to be talking about, obviously, the map design and the gameplay associated with it. Is the map fun? Is the map interesting? Stuff like that. We're also going to be talking about the story that goes on during the map, and also any of the characters we get. Stuff like that. Gameplay for the characters and writing for the characters. It's going to be a very pervasive, thorough look at the whole series, which is why I don't know how far I'm going to get with this, but I figured it'd be a fun thing to at least attempt to start. My assumption is I'm going to peter out somewhere around like FE6, FE7, probably. That's my guess, but I could be wrong. Maybe I won't even make it past Thracia. Anyway, after talking about the chapter, we're going to do what I'm calling the map gauntlet, and that's going to be something that we can talk about more later. It's kind of confusing to talk about without specific examples, so I'll cut the intro short here. I don't want to do anything. This is the first episode, so I don't want to drag this out any longer than it has to be. We're already sitting pretty at about 5 minutes, so yeah, let's just get straight into it. So for news this week, we actually do have something to talk about, so that's pretty cool. First episode, we actually have a little bit going on. The localized version of Fire Emblem 1, Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light, has dropped on the Nintendo eShop. Nintendo Switch eShop. At this point, at the time I'm recording this, it was a little under a week ago. It was about 6 days ago, I think. Although by the time it goes up, it's probably going to be a little over a week ago. Still recent enough, though. I bought it, haven't played it much. I have played FE1 before, haven't beaten it, but I have played it, and it's a fun game. If you've played Gaiden, I know a lot of people are probably more likely to play Gaiden, especially I personally played it before before Echoes came out, and trust me, that's the only reason I would play Gaiden. But FE1 is a lot more people probably are familiar with the remake Shadow Dragon, or even FE3 Book 1, which both of those are arguably a lot better. I mean, FE3 Book 1 cuts a lot of content, so I guess you could argue that that's not great, but for the most part, it's pretty much a direct upgrade. But yeah, it's really cool. I really enjoy the prospect of getting more of these, more so than FE1 specifically that I'm excited about. But I still think it's cool. I still think it was worth supporting. I'm not a huge fan of the limited release model that they seem to be, putting out a lot of right now. But I like Fire Emblem more than I hate that, I guess. So I decided that it would be worth supporting financially, monetarily. So yeah, if you're like me and you just want to see more of these, I mean, it's $6. It's not, it's like the price of overpriced coffee. If you go to Starbucks every day, you spend more on that probably than you do on this. So I'd recommend getting it. But if you don't want to support their anti-consumer, okay, so I probably shouldn't just say that without backing it up a little bit. Basically, I think that it's just a little scummy. It artificially drives up demand. For something that a lot of people maybe just wouldn't want otherwise. Like, I know personally I might have waited a little bit and been like, do I really want to get this? But like, as soon as it dropped, I was like, okay, well, I got to get this, because if I wait too long, it's not going to be available anymore. Like, I was probably going to get it anyway, but it's still, I don't think it's a great practice to get into. But yeah, consider picking it up. It's cool. It's just FE1, it's aged pretty poorly, but it's still an important piece of the franchise history, and it's an interesting game in its own right. At the very least, you can see where a lot of series staples come from. Marth in FE1 is a very interesting unit. He can actually, I believe he has 3 personal weapons in that game. He has the rapier and falchion like normal, but then he also, I believe, is the only one who can wield Mercurius in that game, which is really weird to me. But yeah, check it out. It's interesting. Or watch someone else play it. I'm sure there's some Let's Plays going on of it right now. I know a channel is doing an Iron Man of it right now. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. I recently subscribed to them. I'll plug it in the next episode or something if I remember to do it. I'll look up their channel. Not a lot to talk about, but it's this. Like I said, this is in a series that's going to be exactly swimming in stuff to talk about most of the time. So we might as well just get straight into our chapter discussion for the week, which, if you remember from the beginning, it is the prologue of Fire Emblem 4 Genealogy: The Holy War. This game is cool. I know it's the fan favorite of a lot of people, and I think it's one of the most beloved games in the series, especially by a lot of people haven't played this game because it's a very daunting prospect, especially for those who are maybe newer or less experienced with the series. I know that this wasn't a game that I was willing to tackle for a very long time. It was one of the last Japan-only games I played. But it's definitely, if you haven't played it, well, first of all, don't watch this podcast or listen to this podcast, because I'm going to be spoiling the game rotten, probably even just in this episode. I'm going to try to keep spoilers on stuff not in the chapter to a minimum, but there are things that I'm going to have to talk about even in this chapter. For example, there's a lot of foreshadowing in this chapter that I'm going to talk about, and I can't really talk about the foreshadowing without talking about what exactly is being foreshadowed. So just as a forewarning, you're probably going to get spoiled if you listen to this too much. But anyway, if you're still willing to listen to that and you haven't played FE4, go out and play FE4. It's a great game. Fantastic writing, one of the best stories in the series, maybe the best story in the series. And I hesitate to call the maps fun, but I guess we'll get into that. It's an interesting position where I think the maps are pretty bad, but the gameplay mechanics are good, so it kind of balances out in kind of the opposite way of maybe like what's a game that has good maps but bad gameplay mechanics. I guess I'm honestly kind of FE1. I think FE1 has some solid maps, and I guess we'll talk about more of that with Shadow Dragon. So you boot up the new game, and for this I'm going to assume that you didn't bother watching the intro cutscene, because the intro cutscene does explain some stuff, or at least hint at some stuff that is going to be relevant later on, but if you're like me, you didn't bother with that. You just booted up the game for the first time, and the first thing you are greeted with is a timeline of events, which is very weird. This has not happened, I don't think, in any other Fire Emblem game, where it just opens with a timeline of the backstory of the world, and I can't say that it's particularly effective in this instance either. The only time they tried it, maybe this is why they never did it again, but it just feels like it's tacked on there. It doesn't talk about anything in detail, and it moves really fast, right? And it's kind of a lose-lose, because if they move too fast, then you can't process anything and nothing registers, especially since they're throwing a lot of names at you. But if they move too slowly, then it just takes forever and is boring, and everyone's going to skip it anyway. So I don't, there's nothing they could have really done about it, but at the same time, it's like, why have it in the game, like throw it in an instruction booklet somewhere. And it's not like the stuff on the timeline isn't talked about in the game. It is, not in this chapter. In fact, I don't think any of it is talked about in this chapter, but, later on in the game, it'll be discussed in a lot of depth, so I don't think that this was really necessary at all. The pattern of pointless exposition carries over into the opening narration. Now, this is something that does recur in the series. I think it kind of stopped around like Radiant Dawn time, but at the beginning of most Fire Emblem games, around like the middle of the series, like 4 through 10 maybe, there's an opening narration. Sometimes it comes a few chapters in, just explaining, these are the major countries in the world, this is the major backstory event or events, etc. And this game is no different. Now, in those games, again, I guess I'll revisit these, and I might be wrong about this, but I seem to remember them moving at a decent clip, just because they kept the information to a minimum and really only conveyed what was, maybe not always what was necessary, but what was, pretty relevant to, moving forward throughout the game. In this, they really throw on, what they really do is they throw in a lot of names, right? Like, they throw in a lot of named characters. I actually counted it up. I'm pretty sure, here, let me double check the counter real quick. Yeah, okay, so I just double checked. 17 characters are named in this opening cinematic. Asmer, Kurth, Byron, Ring, Reptor, Langball, Arvis, Claude, Gandalf, Aideen, Sigurd, Midir, Alec, Noish, Arden, Oifi, and Caesar. Now, I misspoke a little bit there. That's not all from the intro narration. Some of that is from the beginning of the chapter, like, this is the current event, what's happening right now, dialogue. But 11 of those 17 characters are named in the opening narration, and not all of them are relevant, right? And I guess that's an argument you can make as well. You don't need to remember all these characters, but there's no way of knowing that, right? Like, there's no way of knowing that Asmer is going to be completely irrelevant to the game, especially since he's the king of the main country. Like, it seems like someone you should have to pay attention to, but I don't actually think we even see him outside of this intro narration. And, same with characters like Ring, doesn't matter. Claude matters a little bit, but isn't really going to be relevant at all until later. But and what's maybe worse about all this is that the characters that do matter are drowned out a little bit by this. And in the case of Arvis, Gandalf, Aideen, and Sigurd, are the 4 probably the most important characters, at least for right now in the story. They have an opportunity to the player has an opportunity to get acquainted with them in this map, right? So, like, if you don't process them here, that's fine. You're gonna meet them in a few minutes anyway. But not all of them. Like Byron's pretty important to the story. Maybe not like directly, but his impact on the story and his relationship with Sigurd is a big deal, and they just kind of throw him away as like a toss away line. Kurth I guess is kind of important. The implications of his death are important. But the real standout ones here to me are Reptor and Langball. These guys are the main, other than Arvis, who doesn't play his hand until like very late into the game. These guys are the main villains of the game. And I don't think after this they're mentioned until like chapter 3 or 2. it's pretty late into Gen 1 that we hear about these guys, and yet they're supposedly the main villains, basically, by the end. I don't know. I'm going on and on about this intro dialogue, but it's just, I think that it is representative of a bigger problem of FE4, where it's a little bit, at times, a little bit too complicated for its own good. And that's going to be a pervasive theme throughout most of the game, is that, yes, the story is cool, yes, the story is really interesting, it uses a lot of words, and a lot of unnecessary fluff to convey what it really can convey in a much shorter way. I could be wrong about, again, I haven't played a lot of these games in a while. FE4 in particular, it's been a very long time since I've played and paid attention to the story, but it's still, what I'm saying is that I might change my mind on that. This is just based on my own recollections. I might get to like chapter 4 and be like, oh, this isn't as bad as I thought it was. Anyway, the actual story of the first chapter, I mean, this has all just been backstory, but at the beginning of the first chapter, we find out that, this is partially in the narration as well, but there is a city called Darna, and Darna is very important to Granvale for reasons that aren't explained, but will be explained later, but that's fine. We don't need to know all that right now. There is a kingdom to the northeast called Isaac that has invaded Darna, killed a whole bunch of people. Granvale does not like that and decides, we are going to declare war on Isaac, and they go off to fight Isaac. While that's happening, they're like, our west is completely fine because we have alliances with both of the countries on our west. No big deal. It was a big deal, because Verdane, which is a kingdom to the west, decided to invade Granvale while this is going on. And yeah, that's basically where the story picks up, is Verdane has invaded Granvale, and Sigurd, who's the protagonist, needs to defend the area because he's the only one left who can really do that. And yeah, I mean, it's a pretty simple premise. The story, for all the flowery and complicated language it uses to convey the backstory, the actual plot of the game is pretty simple at this point. And that's good. I don't consider that to be a bad thing. I think that when it comes to the beginning, the early stages, I think more simplicity is better. And I think this is something that, especially the GBA games, get pretty right. If you're going to do something complicated with your story, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with complexity or depth to a story, but I don't think that at the very beginning is the right place to do it. I think the beginning is the time to introduce your core characters and concepts in a way that's easy to digest and move on quickly. And then the depth can come later. But yeah, this game kind of does the reverse. Alright, so we're introduced to Sigurd, and we don't really get a lot of information on him other than he just wants to protect people and his town and, live up to his father's name, stuff like that. Pretty generic hero stuff. Sigurd is not a generic hero at all. Or I guess a better way to put it would be that he is a generic hero in a world that punishes generic heroes for being that way. And that's pretty interesting. We can talk more about that later. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about Sigurd right now, just because he gets much more characterization later. I'm going to spend more time talking about the characters that pretty much just get this chapter, maybe a couple conversations later, and then that's it. Noish, we meet Noish and Alec and Arden are all here, and they're fun. They have a fun little dynamic. I mean, everyone kind of makes fun of this conversation. Especially in the older translation. I'm playing the Project Naga translation, which is phenomenal, by the way, but it did take away some of the charm from this conversation specifically, where Arden is being is upset that they're calling him slow. It's hard to explain. I mean, he still says that in the new translation, but it's the wording is a lot funnier in the older one, in my opinion. But yeah, Alec and Noish are basically like, yeah, we'll accompany you because we're knights, and Sigurd's like, no, you got to stay behind and help defend the castle, and they're like, fuck no, absolutely not. Arden, though, gets left behind to defend the castle. I mean, obviously you can take him with you if you want to, but he gets relegated to guard duty basically in the story. And spoiler, that's what I did with him this chapter. Sometimes I try to use Arden. This is not going to be one of those playthroughs that I try to use Arden. And then Oifi's here. Oifi is basically the tactician. People joke about how he's probably going to get made into the Avatar character when they remake this game. They didn't do it with Gaiden, so hopefully they won't do it with this one. He's not playable yet. He will be in Gen 2. I'll talk more about Gen 2 at a later time, but yeah, he's just a side character for right now. He basically just hangs out with Sigurd and gives him information and helps his battle plans and stuff like that. And yeah, it's a pretty standard bunch. I mean, there's not really anything that sets these guys apart from like the normal starting crew, but that's fine. Again, this simplicity doesn't really matter. This game doesn't have support conversations. It does have a lot of in-chapter dialogue, that is good for the most part. But a lot of the supporting characters don't necessarily get in-chapter conversations, or at least not a lot of them that characterize them in an interesting way. So for the most part, this is all these guys are going to get. Arden is a little bit different. Alec and Noish, though, I think they maybe have. I think Alec has like a conversation with Sylvia in chapter 2 where he simps after her a bit, and then Noish maybe has something with, I think, maybe Aira. I could be wrong though. I don't know. Anyway, so the map starts, and you say I'm. This is the first episode blues because I'm not sure if I want to talk about like all the story first, or if I want to talk about all the gameplay first, or just talk about like both as they become relevant. I think I'm going to talk about the map first, and I'm going to talk about what makes the map interesting. Is it good? Is it fun to play? The short answer is kind of. The thing that makes this map interesting, and this you're going to notice this a lot when I talk about whether maps are good or not, is the big question I ask: do you have multiple things going on at once, or is your army doing the same thing? Like all the members of your army doing the same thing, fighting in the same place. For this chapter, I mean, it kind of forces you to split up a little bit, not only to save the villages, but also some of your characters join in, spread out positions. I mean, I guess Quan, Ethlin, and Finn join near your castle, but Lex and Azel join to the north, which is pretty separated from where you are, and they do their own thing for a while there. So the game does force you pretty extensively to split up and to speed up, which is another thing. Does the chapter have anti-turtling incentives? Turtling is basically exactly what it sounds like. You huddle all your units together and just move very slowly throughout the map. There's no incentive to rush. There's no incentive to take risks, or play in a way that's just not optimized and raging ball of death. This game, I mean, in pretty much every chapter has a built-in anti-turtling incentive, because every chapter has villages that are going to be attacked by bandits, whereas in later games, not every chapter has that, only some do. So I think that that's a pretty effective way to make the player move. I mean, a lot of the time, you're not going to lose a whole lot by losing the villages. You might just lose some gold, which isn't a huge deal. And in fact, most of the villages are like placed in a way where it's very unlikely that you'll get to them in time to save them like in their entirety, because unlike in later games, it doesn't take just one turn for a bandit to destroy a village. It takes 10 turns. So most of the time you're going to get there after it's been sacked for a couple turns. You'll get some gold, but not all of it. And that's a pretty effective way to encourage the player to speed up, but also not punish them too harshly if they fail, which is good. I think especially for chapter 1, or I guess I should say prologue, it is that's an effective way to introduce the player to some concepts, make it punishing but not overly so. The rest of the problem is that once you get to the midpoint of the chapter where you capture the first castle, the game kind of grinds to a halt a little bit. The way the game works is that in later games, especially in like FE6 and FE11, where every chapter was like this except for the final ones, in some maps you have to seize. Your main character has to get to a certain point and hit the seize command, and then you win the map. This game is ostensibly like that too, except you need to do it multiple times per map. And that can lead to some interesting dynamics, because a lot of the time, in fact I think almost all the time, the next map, or the next part of the map I should say, will not open or become accessible until you clear the first part. But you don't necessarily have to do it right away. So what you can do, and what I did for this map, is you clear out all the enemies and you make sure that all the villagers are saved and stuff before Sigurd captures the first castle. You have all your units prepped to take on the army that comes from the next one. If you know what you're doing, it's actually pretty easy. I actually recommend playing this game blind. I'm not always going to recommend that. I think that for some games, you're just asking for trouble and having a miserable time if you play it like that. Thracia, I'm going to try not to rag on Thracia too much because I don't like Thracia, but I'm going to save it for when I actually talk about Thracia. Thracia is not a game that I would recommend playing blind. I think it is a miserable experience if you play blind. FE4, I think you can actually get away with playing blind and still have a good time. So anyway, because when you don't play blind, you know that there's going to be a huge army coming from the west, and that you got to have your units set up so that they deal with that effectively. And that's just, sometimes, I don't know who said this. There was some game developer who said that when given the opportunity, players will optimize the fun out of anything. And I think that's absolutely true, especially in regards to Fire Emblem. Sometimes, your brain's like, oh, I got to do it the right way, but it's just a lot less interesting that way sometimes. Okay, yeah, so I should talk a little bit about the role of mounted units in this game. This general gameplay discussion is going to be less and so as the game goes on, because there's going to be less mechanics to talk about for the first time. But yeah, when you're playing this game, you're probably going to notice, hey, there's a lot of mounted units, and they're way better than anything else I have access to. And that's because the maps are enormous. And mounted units have Canto, which is different than it works in other games, because in this game, you can move even after attacking or healing, and reposition yourself that way. So you can, not only can you attack and then retreat to safety, you can also attack and progress your full movement on the same turn, whereas in other games you would have to decide, okay, well, do I want to get to this objective faster, or do I want to take out this enemy with my mounted unit? You don't have to make that decision anymore. You can just do both, which is insane. That's part of the reason why Sigurd's so good. I'll talk more about the different units and their gameplay viability later. And keep in mind that's all opinion based, but based in what the general consensus kind of is. Yeah, I think that trying to play this game without a whole bunch of mounted units is just a nightmare. This map is a lot better about it. It gives mounted... actually, I guess maybe not really, because it's weird. There are opportunities for foot units to do things in later maps, and I will point them out for sure. Especially if you know what you're doing and you know where to put them to be used to maximum effectiveness. But in this map, it's really just a mad dash to one end of the map, to the middle of the map and to the west side of the map. I guess at the end, when the army is coming from the west, you can have foot units help out there. But, I guess that's not really true. Azel helps a little bit at the top. I don't know. It's little things. But for the most part, I do think that you're better off just keeping a mostly full team of mounted units. There's no deployment limit in this game, so you could theoretically train everyone, even Arden, but, that's probably only going to train maybe 2/3 to 3/4 of your group realistically, unless you really want to train more than that. But yeah, I'd recommend at least half your army be mounted, maybe more. That's just a personal recommendation. I find it a lot more boring to play with non-mounted units. Trying to give them kills and feed them experience. There are ways to get items and experience on foot units without having them fight in the chapter. We could talk about the arena next chapter, because that's when we get introduced to it. I'll also talk about sailing and stuff next chapter, because that's when it becomes useful. In this chapter, there's not really a whole lot of reason to visit the pawn shop. We need to talk about the Silver Sword. Sigurd gets a Silver Sword in this map, and it is absolutely busted, and it's one of the reasons why he's one of the best lords in all of Fire Emblem. He's already got great stats. The only thing you could say is, well, Steel Sword's not that great. I mean, even Noich has a Steel Sword, right? He could do a little bit better. He gets a fucking Silver Sword, and you can't even say oh, maybe it's better on someone else, because, well, first of all, he has the best combat and is mounted. No one else has even close to as good combat as him, just in raw stats alone, and is also mounted. But also, I think for at least most of the game, he's the only one who can even use it, so you couldn't even give it to someone else if you wanted to. Yeah, it's ridiculous that he gets a Silver Sword. It's insane. Yeah, Sigurd's absolutely busted. Yeah. I mean, that's really it. That's all I have to say about this map. In terms of how fun is it? It's kind of mid, I guess. I wouldn't call it bad. It's just fine. It introduces a lot of concepts to you all at once, most of which aren't explained, but a lot of them are pretty self-explanatory anyway, so it doesn't really matter. I decided I wanted to use Noich this run. Noich is a good unit. A lot of people don't think he is. I think he is. I think it's hard-ish to train both Alec and Noich, at least early on. I think that later it gets a little bit easier. The thing with Noich is that he requires a huge investment, and that is the pursuit ring, which you don't get until chapter 2. But once we get it, it's going straight on Noish. I don't think this is a huge opportunity cost. Because if you think about it, who else wants the pursuit ring, right? No one else has a mount and doesn't have pursuit. I don't think. At least not in this generation. Depending on your pairings, maybe next generation. Now Quan. Yeah, that's true. But Quan isn't around for the whole thing. I guess you could give it to Quan. But yeah, I think that Noish makes fine use of it. Quan's not really like I don't know. I don't think he would be doing a whole lot of doubling anyway, especially once you start to fight the units that have more swords and magic, maybe even other lances. He doesn't double because he's not particularly fast. Noish, on the other hand, uses swords, which means that he only gets weighed down by a tiny little bit, and is therefore really, really good at doubling, and can probably double most lance and axe enemies when he fights them with the pursuit ring. The only other one who really wants it is Ethlin, not because Ethlin wants it, but because Leaf wants it. And I don't think it's that hard to get it on Leaf in Gen 2 anyway, so yeah, I don't know. I want to give it to Noish. I've never used Noish before. I've used Alec. I think Alec's also pretty underrated, but that's a story for a different day, I guess, because I'm not using Alec this run. Anyone else? Yeah, I like to use Finn. I always kind of don't commit to him until like chapter 2 when he gets the Brave Lance, because that's when I decide, okay, am I going to keep it on Finn or am I going to give it to Arvis? I mean, sometimes I do both, but I should say sometimes I give it to Arvis and then still train Finn, but a lot of the time if I decide I'm going to use Finn, I'm going to keep it on him. If I decide I'm not going to use Finn, I give it to Arvis. It's fine to give it to Arvis and then still train Finn. I actually recommend you do that, but that's just kind of how I choose to play. Every single time, though, I do actually get the speed ring on Finn, and I think that this is a good decision, because I don't think anyone else really wants it, at least not in this map, right? Because, Quan can't double. Sigurd already is way faster than he'll ever need to be. I guess, like, if you want to use Alec, there might be some instances where if you want him to use a lance, but I think Finn makes the best use of it because he's got good speed, but he also weighs himself down with lances, and he doesn't have the option to not weigh himself down, whereas Alec, if he wants to be faster, he can always use a sword. Otherwise, I can't really think of anyone else who wants it. Again, maybe later, maybe like if you want to do like meme Lex builds, possibly. I don't know. Noish has been kind of hard to train. I forgot to mention this because he actually got 2 blank levels. I think I gave him 4 levels this map, and he got 2 blank levels, which is not fun. Not fun at all. Arden. Let's talk about Arden. Arden is really, really bad. One of the worst units in any Fire Emblem game relative to their game. He's just so... I already talked about why mounted units are so good, because the maps are enormous. You really want high move. Anything less than that is going to be tedious. You can make some foot units work, but typically I only like to do that if they have the combat to justify it. Someone like Aira or Lewin later, or some Gen 2 characters. Arden does not have good combat. Arden gets the pursuit ring. That's kind of nice, and he can actually sometimes double because he uses swords, so he doesn't have to worry about being weighed down. So he can fight like some units that use axes. I don't even think he doubles most lance-wielding enemies. I could be wrong about that. But he's really, really bad. His movement is just so bad. He doesn't have great... Again, pursuit is nice, but he doesn't even have like... He doesn't have swords. So he can't, unless you give him like the Braves. There are some meme builds you can do with Arden, don't get me wrong. It's easy to make just about anyone good in FE4, but Arden is probably the hardest one to make good out of all of them, except maybe like Till 2. I'm benching him. I've used Arden in the past. I do think he's a lot of fun, but I have decided to bench him. So far on the bench, it's him and Alec. Everyone else is kind of like... I mean, there's no reason to not use Quan and Ethlin. They're both really, really good. Ethlin is a great mounted staff bot, and then Quan is just really good for combat. He has Adept. He can proc Adept sometimes. That's nice. He has big damage. He's not as tanky as I always expect him to be. I think it's because he faces weapon triangle a lot in the first map and the second map. But he can tank reasonably well. And then Finn is the only one that I ever bench, really. I mean, there's no reason to bench him right now because he's good. Even when he gets his Brave Lance, you can still use him for a while. But he's the only character that comes back in Gen 2, which is interesting. This is the only playable one. And I don't think that's necessarily a reason to use him, but I do think it gives him a bit of a niche over characters like Alec and Noish. Yeah, oh, Azel and Lex. I almost forgot about those two. Azel's so interesting because he's a foot unit that promotes into a mount. There's not many of those. I think he might be the only one in Gen 1. If he's not, I think it's like, yeah, I think he might be the only one. And that gives him potential if you're willing to put up with him for 20 levels being on foot. And his combat isn't even that bad. I mean, he can one-round some pirates in this map, which is cool. It's really easy to feed him experience. He can chip from a distance a lot of the time, which is nice. He can get some experience that way. I don't think using Azel is as much of an uphill battle as using someone like Arden. I would argue even maybe easier than using someone like Holland, although that's debatable. And then once he gets that promotion, I mean, you're good to go. So I think he can be fun to use. I don't know if I'm going to use him this run. And Lex, I don't think I'm going to use Lex either. I really like Lex. I do. This is going to be the run of me trying out characters that I've never used before, I think. So it's going to be like Noish, probably going to try to use Jamke, however you pronounce it, stuff like that. Who else do I not normally use? I don't bench a lot of people in Gen 1 because it's so easy to just use everyone a lot of the time, except for like the terrible ones. Yeah, I mean, I guess I could use Lewin more. I didn't use Lewin a whole lot last playthrough. I don't know. We'll see. Alright. I think that's really all I wanted to talk about in terms of gameplay. Overall, this map is fine. I don't think it's really that great, but it's also, as far as FE4 maps go, it's pretty inoffensive. Inoffensive. I think that there are better FE4 maps, even in Part 1. I think there are also way, way worse FE4 maps, especially in Part 1. Chapters 1 and 2 are going to be not fun. But yeah, alright, let's talk a little bit about the story, because the story in this first chapter is mostly unremarkable, but there are some things that I think are interesting about it. So first of all, the first thing that popped out to me, the first thing I made a note on, is the fact that they refer to the Verdane people as savages. There's a few mentions of this throughout the chapter. I think Arvis mentions it. The idea that these guys are somehow like less developed or inferior in some way, which is interesting. I mean, it's pretty generic rhetoric, but it's not something you would normally expect to see from like the good guy country. FE4 doesn't have a super clear-cut concept of good guys versus bad guys, and this might be the first indication of that. I think that it implies a few things. The first one, obviously, if we want to take it that route, Kaga could just be being a little sus here. I mean, I don't really know anything about Kaga's political values, but I mean, that was the first like worst case scenario that popped into my mind, was maybe Kaga is just like, oh yeah, obviously they live in like the forest and worship like spirit magic. They're just fucking weird cultists who are beneath everyone else. I don't necessarily think that's what he was going for. I certainly hope not, but that is certainly a conclusion that you can reach if you wanted to. But yeah, I think the biggest thing that it's suggesting at, and this is actually not something that we find out until much later, Verdane is one of the two countries in Yggdrasil that does not associate with any of the Crusaders. There's like, I think 7 countries? No, 6? That do associate with the Crusader. And then 2 more. So 8 countries in total. Is that right? That can't be right. I don't know. There's something like that. Verdane is one, and the other one is Militos. Militos doesn't really get talked about in this way. Militos seems to be more of like a merchant country. There's a lot of trade and business there. It's like surrounded on all sides by water, so it's probably got a lot of ports and stuff like that. So maybe they just don't talk badly about it because there's like a bunch of rich people living there. That's how I always imagined it, is but being a bunch of rich assholes. But Verdane, they do specifically call out as being savages a lot, and I think that has something to do with it. This is kind of just headcanon. I mean, I have no reason to think this, but it's the religion of the Crusaders is a big deal in this world, and the fact that Verdane doesn't have a Crusader that it associates with, or that it I guess worships is the wrong word, but that it doesn't have like a royal family descended from a crusader the same way that every other country does. I think that I think that it might be an indication that it kind of is looked down upon by the other nations of the world, or at least by Granville. We don't really get other people's opinions on Verdane, but Granville is associated with a whopping 7 of the Crusaders, so I think that that's definitely something that's a possibility. I don't know. I thought it was worth talking about. I thought it was interesting. There's a lot of foreshadowing in this chapter. If you want to call what I just talked about foreshadowing, you could. But there's also, they name drop Tyrfing. This is the first time that we get a holy weapon name dropped. I didn't realize it was this early. It's in a village, I should specify. A lot of the village dialogue, I'm visiting all the villages and making note of all the dialogue. Most of them, at least in this chapter, were very unremarkable, but they did name drop Tyrfing. I thought that was cool. They also talk about Andre, who is a minor villain in Gen 1. He's Aideen's younger sister. This village talks about, Aideen's younger brother. It talks about Aideen's family, basically. It talks about how they had a daughter, Bridget, who was lost to pirates. I think they think she's dead. I don't actually know. But they say that she was lost to pirates, which obviously foreshadows Bridget coming back. But also, they talk about Andre and how he's not getting along well with Ring now that he's older. And I thought this was really interesting foreshadowing. I completely forgot that this was in the game. But yeah, Ring comes back as a major, or sorry, not Ring. Andre comes back as a major villain. I'm pretty sure he kills Ring. He kills his own father, and that's the fact that they put this idea in your head so early on is interesting. I don't even know if I paid attention to the villages the first time I played through FE4, so I think there's going to be a lot of stuff in here that I'm like, I can't believe they talked about that. That's interesting. There's not a lot to talk about. That was the 2 things I just mentioned were 2 out of I think like 5 villages that had anything interesting to say, and I'm pretty sure the ratio just gets worse from there. But yeah, those are some cool instances of dialogue. The other piece of foreshadowing I wanted to talk about is Arvis. Arvis is introduced for the first time in this map, and I can't say that his introduction is particularly subtle. If you go and look up his theme music, not his battle theme music, but his like overworld theme music when he shows up like as like a character in this prologue, I think it's just called Emperor Arvis, and it is very dark, very menacing and ominous. At least I interpreted it that way. Is not subtle at all, in my opinion, that he's going to come back as a bad guy. But his dialogue is, and I have to give a lot of credit to the Project Naga developers here for translating his dialogue so well. It's so like subtly ominous if you know what is going to happen, but completely innocuous if you don't. 2 lines in particular really stood out to me. One is, the context is that he's talking about Azel, who is his younger brother, being with Sigurd. And he says, I'd prefer if he were to stay by my side, but perhaps this is how it must be. And he kind of trails off. He does like the ... I think that's super interesting. I think it's unreasonable for me to say that Sigurd, or that Arvis knows he's going to end up killing Sigurd. But I don't think it's like out of his mind as a possibility. We know how desperate he is to grab, I guess desperate's the wrong word. We know how ruthless he is and how much he wants to get power. And I think that he's toyed around with the idea of like, what if I had to betray Sigurd, right? And that's that line of like, well, I wish Azel was with me, but I guess if I gotta murk him with Sigurd, oh well. That's really dark, and I know that you could probably interpret it a different way. It might be a little bit more realistic. I don't necessarily know if that's what the developers were trying to convey there, but that's just how I interpreted it. I thought it was really interesting. The other one is be sure that he learns from this experience. Again, talking about Azel, which again has some dark undertones there of like, he's gonna learn his lesson and regret it. I don't know. Again, maybe a little bit of a stretch. I love this idea that like the dialogue is just so rich with double entendre of him being this cold, calculating, not maniacal, but like this mastermind behind the scenes, as opposed to what it comes across to a blind player, which is just oh, it's just the normal guy who's concerned about his brother. I mean, again, I think that the music kind of conveys his true intentions a little bit, but not to the point where I think it undermines this excellent introductory dialogue. This is during his conversation with Sigurd, by the way, when he gives him the silver sword. Oh yeah, he also insults Sigurd. Like the first thing he does is like, "Huh, it's taking Sigurd a really long time to kill these guys. I'm not very impressed," or something like that. Very callous. Oh, okay. So yeah, let's talk about some of the character interactions. Um, I already talked a little bit about Alec, Noish, and Arden's conversation at the beginning. I do think Project Naga did a good job with it, although I think it is a little bit blander compared to what it used to be. That's just me, but I do think that they did a good job with Lex and Azel's conversation here, which is they show up and Lex is like, hey, why'd you want to come help out Sigurd? And Sigurd and Azel's like, oh well, I can't just do nothing or something like that, something generic. But then Lex teases him as like, oh, you have a crush on Nadine, so that's why you came. And Azel's like, baka. I don't know. I thought it was cute. They're best friends, and that's made explicit later on. Lex talks to Sigurd, which is another one of my favorite conversations. The chapter, Lex basically says, "Listen, I'm not doing this for you. I have." He wasn't like a dick about it, but he's just very like upfront, like, "Hey, I don't really like care about you. I'm just doing this as a favor to my best friend." Which I don't know. I thought it was a cute conversation. It characterizes Lex very well as like, listen, he's just gonna be upfront with you, but he's also very loyal to his friends. I mean, he's charging headfirst into possibly death for his best friend. I think I think a little dialogue goes a long way here. The other in chapter conversations have the same problem as the intro cutscene, where they give a lot of exposition in a not very eloquent way. The big one for me was Quan and Sigurd. They talk about how basically it's a whole conversation about, hey, remember how we made that promise as best friends when we were at the Night Academy together? You, me, and Eldegon made a promise that we were always gonna stay by each other's side. Like, I know it's like a trope. I know it's a very common way of conveying information in especially Japanese media, but it's just, I don't know. It's this game can do so much better. Like I'm being very down on its storytelling right now, but just know I am doing this because I know it gets so much better. And I did not remember it starting off this heavy-handed. Also with Ethlin and Sigurd, there's some dialogue about how he's like, oh man, remember when our mom died and you had to take care of us? Like, come on, this is not how people talk to each other. It's just not. Yeah, I don't know. I thought it was a little bit. It was funny, but not in the way I don't think it was meant to be funny. I think it was meant to, and it was cute and it was heartwarming, but it was also like, come on, there's no reason for this. Overall, I think that this is a good introduction to the game's story. I think that it characterizes almost everyone very well, and even though it's a little bit heavy-handed with the exposition at times, I think it still conveys a lot of useful information. I mean, it is good that we know about Quan and Sigurd's relationship. It is good that we know about Ethlin and Sigurd's relationship. It characterizes Lex well. It characterizes Azel a little bit, not as much as I would like. Characterizes Arden very well. Alec and Noish a little bit left out to dry. Finn, I think, gets exactly one line. He doesn't have any mid-chapter dialogue, and I think he only has one line in his little introductory blurb. But we'll learn more about Finn later. He's actually one of the best characters in this game, in the series in general, in my opinion. But yeah, otherwise, I think that's all I wanted to talk about for this map. Solid map, story-wise, a little bit mediocre gameplay-wise. It doesn't get better right away. It gets worse, actually, for a while, but then it gets better. So yeah, with that done, I think we can move on to our final segment, which is going to be very short, because I'm just going to explain the rules, and then you guys will understand. It's our map gauntlet. And now this is I'm going to try to explain this in as eloquent a way as possible so that I don't confuse anyone. Okay, so I've been listening to a podcast recently, and the podcast is called Besties. It recently came back, and when it came back, it's by the same people who do like My Brother and Me and The Adventure Zone, Justin and Griffin McElroy, along with Chris Plant and Russ Rushtick, people who work at Polygon. And they have a podcast called The Besties, and nowadays I don't actually know what it's like, because when it came back with a vengeance, I was like, okay, well, I want to start this, but I want to start it from all the way back at the beginning, back in 2012. And they've stopped doing this since then. I don't know if they picked it back up again. I'm still in like mid-2013. But in 2012, they had a system where they were like, we're going to pick the best game of the year. So we're going to play a bunch of games, and we're going to pick which one is the best every week. That one's going to be our reigning champion. And then next week, we're going to pick the best game of the week, compare it to the last reigning champion, and decide which game is better. If it's the old game, it stays the reigning champ. If it's the new game, it dethrones the old one, and they move on from there. And then eventually they would have the best game. Ostensibly, that's what it was. I'm going to do the exact same thing. So in other words, every week, we're going to take the chapters that I played. For FE4, it's only going to be one chapter a week, so it'll be a very easy decision, and we're going to say, what's the best chapter we played this week? This week, it is FE4 Prologue. Big surprise. Then we're going to take a look at our reigning champ, which right now is nothing, because we just started. And we are going to say, is this new map of the week better than the last one? Well, if we were talking about Chapter 1, I would not confidently say that it is better than nothing, but Prologue is definitely better than nothing. So we can say for sure that our new reigning champ, our first reigning champ for the map Gauntlet, is FE4 Prologue. At the end of every game, we will take whatever map is on top, we'll file it away somewhere, and say this is the best map of FE4. And then at the end, assuming that I get to the end, which would be a very long time from now, if I continue with this up till FE16, FE17 might be out by the time I'm finished. Yeah, once we have the best map from every game, we are going to take all of those best maps from each game, and we're going to do something with them, probably some kind of bracket. I don't know. We'll figure all that out later. But for right now, our reigning champ is the FE4 Prologue. This part of the podcast is going to be a little skimpy while we're in FE4, because the whole process of like what's the best chapter we played this week is going to be obviously null and void. So we're only going to say, is this chapter better than the last one? I think, as unremarkable as I found this map to be gameplay-wise, I should mention I'm only talking about it gameplay-wise. I'm not factoring in the story. I'm not factoring in how much I like the characters. I'm just talking about how fun was this map to play from a gameplay perspective. And that's what we're going to base it on. I don't think that Prologue is getting dethroned anytime soon. So let's just leave it at that. Thank you for sticking it all the way to the end. There's some growing pains here. I have never done anything like this before, so it's probably going to be kind of bad for a while, but hopefully it'll pick up steam. But other than that, that's all I have to say. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will see you all next week. Bye-bye.